The wind came first, long before the sun had risen, before the hens stirred in their crooked coop, before the coffee boiled in its soot-blackened pot. It came like a memory too big for the sky to hold, sweeping across the plain and brushing its cold fingers along the rough edges of her cabin. The woman stirred beneath a threadbare quilt, waking not from sleep but from the kind of stillness that only resembles it. Her name had not been spoken aloud in weeks. Not by another voice, at least. But she didn't need to hear it to remember who she was. She rose slow, like she'd done every morning since the day she was left behind. The cabin groaned under its own bones. Dust drifted through sunbeams like old ghosts, and the fire, long since burned to embers, waited for her touch. She knelt, tucked a few sticks beneath what was left of yesterday's heat, and breathed gently, once, twice. Flame caught. It always did. And somehow that felt like a small kind of miracle. Outside, frost painted lace over the window panes, and the sky was the bruised color of a faded bruise. She wrapped herself in a shawl, the one her mother wove years ago when hands were still kind, and stepped outside. Her boots crunched through frozen dirt as she passed the empty rocker, the one she used to share with someone who promised forever but vanished before spring. The chickens clucked softly, half asleep. She scattered feed and whispered to them like old friends. That's how she spoke to most things now, soft, as if the world might shatter if handled too rough. Her horse stood in the far stall of the barn, dark-eyed and watchful. He was her one remaining constant, born the same summer her child was supposed to come. The child didn't make it. The horse did. She named him Birch, for no reason other than she liked the way it sounded. He nickered gently when she touched his forehead, pressing close like he remembered a time before everything cracked. She didn't cry anymore. Not often. Grief had settled into her like weather, sometimes dry and brittle, sometimes heavy and thick, but always present. The town forgot her. Or maybe it had never really known her. She'd come west with a man whose eyes were full of promises and silences he never unpacked. When he left, the promises went with him, and the silence stayed. The last time she rode to town, someone called her widow in passing, though no one knew for sure. She didn't correct them. Let the label stick. It was easier that way. Cleaner. Like grief could be catalogued if you just used the right word. She spent her days tending what little the land gave, fixing things that didn't want to be fixed, and writing letters she never mailed. At night, she read them aloud to the fire, her voice the only echo in a room that used to hold two. That morning, something shifted. Not in the sky or the earth, but in her. A quiet restlessness stirred, like a sparrow trapped behind her ribs. She baked early, more bread than she needed. She plucked herbs from the window box and bundled them with twine. She swept the floor twice, though once would have done. By midday, the wind had calmed, but her heart hadn't. She stood on her porch, mug in hand, staring out toward the wide horizon. That's when she saw them. 7 dark figures riding slow, cutting a path through golden grass, horses lifting dust in solemn rhythm. They came not like a storm, but like a song, low and certain. She squinted, heart thudding like a forgotten drum. Not soldiers. Not settlers. No wagons. Just men on horseback, dressed in leather and shadow, adorned with beads and feathers that caught the sun like stars. Comanche. She didn't move. Didn't hide. What would be the point? The land was flat for miles. If they meant harm, she'd already be swallowed. But something in their pace said otherwise. They weren't charging. They weren't scouting. They were arriving. She stepped off the porch as they drew closer. She felt her breath lodge in her throat. One of them, younger than the rest, wore a red cloth tied around his arm. His gaze was steady, but not unkind. Behind him, an older warrior with silver in his hair scanned the place with the quiet of someone who's seen too much to be startled. The group stopped a few yards from her fence. No one spoke. Only the horses exhaled, steam rising from their nostrils into the cool air. She set her mug down on the railing. Her voice, when it came, cracked like thawing earth. "You hungry?" No one answered. Then the young one nodded. Just once. A breath of a gesture. She disappeared inside, her hands trembling not from fear, but from something stranger, an awareness that she'd just cracked the seal on a chapter she hadn't meant to open. She brought out a basket, bread, dried apples, strips of smoked venison. She left it on the ground between them, then backed away. The oldest dismounted, took the basket, gave a slow nod. Respect, not thanks. Then they turned their horses toward the trees and disappeared behind the ridge, like the land had swallowed them whole. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking of the young one's eyes, dark but not empty. Eyes like hers used to be. She sat by the fire, Birch's soft breath audible from the barn through the wall. It wasn't until morning that she noticed the carving on the porch. Small, hand-shaped. A bird in flight, whittled from cedar. Not left by accident. She held it in her palm like it might warm her fingers. The wind outside was still. But inside, something had shifted. A door she'd long thought locked had clicked open, just a crack. And just beyond it, footsteps were coming. They came again the next day, not as a group, but as a thread of presence unraveling slowly across the horizon. The wind stirred their shadows across the field, long silhouettes that folded and unfolded like paper birds along the edge of the world. She stood still, one hand resting on the porch post, heart pulsing like something trying not to be noticed. They did not speak when they arrived, nor did she. The silence between them held something sacred, neither fear nor welcome, but a recognition that the ground beneath them had changed. This time they didn't dismount. One of the older men tied a piece of white cloth to her fence post before riding off. It fluttered like a breath in the morning sun. She didn't touch it. Instead, she whispered to it, not words but something older, something like thanks. For 2 days they did not return. She convinced herself they had simply passed through. That she'd imagined the connection, the way the youngest rider had watched her, not with desire, not even with curiosity, but with an aching kind of stillness, like he knew how to wait without expecting anything to arrive. But on the 3rd day she found the bird again. Not the same one. This one had wings spread wide, carved deeper, the grain of the cedar feathered and smooth. It sat on her porch rail as if it belonged there. The gesture stopped her cold. Someone had been close, closer than before, and yet she hadn't heard a sound. That evening, she saddled Birch and rode out toward the creek a mile west. The grass there grew longer, the cottonwoods shivered in loose harmony, and the water sang soft beneath the stones. She dismounted slowly, her boots pressing indentations into the soft earth. When she rounded the bend, she saw them, 5 of them this time, scattered along the bank. They weren't gathered in ceremony or hunting or talking. They were simply being, breathing. She stayed back, watching. The young one sat alone beneath a crooked sycamore, carving again. This time, not a bird. Something smaller. A fish or maybe a leaf. He hadn't seen her yet, or maybe he had and chose not to react. She watched the way his fingers moved, careful, precise, with the kind of patience most people had long since lost. He looked up. Their eyes met. He didn't stand. Didn't flinch. She didn't wave or call out. She just nodded, barely, and turned back toward her horse. She didn't ride fast. She didn't need to. That night, she found the fish, delicately shaped, tail curved, a tiny crack running through its center, resting on her doorstep. On the 6th day, the boy came alone. He didn't ride all the way up to the cabin. He tethered his horse near the fence and walked the rest on foot, hands empty, boots silent over the dry soil. She was in the garden, pulling up what remained of the turnips, her fingers streaked with dirt and the smell of roots. When she looked up, he was already standing there, 10 paces off, waiting. There was no fear between them, only a shared uncertainty, like 2 notes of a song unsure if they belonged to the same melody. She wiped her hands on her apron. He held out his palm, slowly, and revealed a stone, round, pale, smooth like river glass. Not a gift, not exactly. Just a presence. She took it without speaking, feeling its cool weight settle into her skin. When she looked up again, his eyes hadn't moved. He sat on the stump near the barn. She went back to her work. For an hour they stayed like that, two lives folding gently around the edges of one another. When she carried a basket into the kitchen, she left the door unlatched. He didn't come inside, but he waited until dusk before walking back to his horse. That became their rhythm. He would come. She would work. He would stay. She would offer bread or stew or apples. He would carve. Sometimes they'd speak in glances, in breaths, in the language people forget exists when they only listen with their ears. Once she asked his name. Her voice trembled around the words. He paused, then touched his chest lightly and said it, soft in his tongue. She didn't repeat it. Not yet. It wasn't hers to hold. Later, he placed a new carving in her hand. A horse, slender and poised, as if ready to run. She traced it with her thumb, then met his gaze and said, "Thank you." He didn't smile. But something in him loosened, like a knot untied by wind. Still, the others had begun to watch. One afternoon, she noticed the way two of the older warriors looked at him as he returned from her cabin. Not angry, just wary. As if they knew something was blooming and couldn't decide whether it would become a flower or a fire. She tried not to think about it. Let the days slip by. But the world had a way of noticing peace just before it tried to shatter it. Word had spread in town. A storekeeper's wife mentioned seeing Comanche riders near the creek. A trapper claimed they'd stolen a rifle, though no one had proof. Eyes turned toward the prairie with suspicion sharpened by ignorance. She knew how that would go. The ones who feared what they didn't understand were always loudest. She thought of telling the young man, of warning him. But each time he came, her words caught in her throat. She didn't want to color the quiet between them with the world's noise. Not yet. And then one morning, she stepped outside and found something new carved in the wood of her porch beam. A hand. Open, palm up. A symbol she didn't understand, but felt down to her bones. An offering. Or a warning. She ran her fingers over it, the wood still fresh beneath her skin. Behind her, the wind picked up again. But it wasn't empty this time. It carried with it the unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats. And not just one. The hoofbeats slowed before they reached her fence. She didn't turn immediately. She stood with a wooden spoon in hand, stirring a pot of broth on the stove, pretending she hadn't heard them long before they'd arrived. Pretending her heart wasn't already halfway out the door. When she finally stepped outside, they were waiting. All seven. Dismounted now, standing in a loose circle near the edge of her garden where the late potatoes still clung to dry vines. The elder among them stepped forward, broad-shouldered, a face lined like wind-etched stone. His eyes did not soften. He pointed to the hand carved into her porch beam, and then looked to the youngest, the one who carved it. The message was clear. A line had been crossed. She held her ground. Her palms were dry and her voice, when it came, held no tremble. He helps. That's all. The elder said nothing. His gaze flicked to the horizon, as if searching for time itself. Then, one by one, they mounted again and rode west, kicking dust behind them that curled like smoke. Only one remained. He didn't speak. Just stepped toward her, slow and deliberate, like he was trying not to frighten the earth beneath his feet. She watched him with the same reverence she once had for the last ember in a dying fire. Precious. Dangerous. You should go, she said quietly, not out of desire, but out of duty. He looked down, then reached into his satchel and drew out another carving, this one shaped like a heart, but split down the center, hollowed just enough for two smaller pieces to fit inside. She took it. Her fingers trembled, traitorous. He reached forward, not to touch her, but to close her hand around the carving. Then he stepped back, mounted, and rode into the dusk. That night she didn't light a lamp. She sat in darkness, the carved heart cradled in her lap. Birch huffed gently outside. The silence, once a comfort, now felt unbearable. She didn't sleep. By morning she had packed a small basket, bread, the last of her apples, a jar of honey, and rode east. Not to town. Not to the Comanche. Just to ride, to move, to breathe something other than stillness. Her shawl caught the breeze like a wing as she moved across the plain, hair loose, eyes sharp. It felt good to move, to carry purpose without knowing its end. By the time she returned home, the sky was the color of iron and the wind carried tension like a taut wire. She saw the man before she reached the barn. He was waiting, seated on the old stump near the fence, shoulders bowed like a man weathering more than just weather. She dismounted, walked toward him, and sat beside him without asking. They didn't speak for a long time. He began to carve again, this time a horse with a broken leg. The detail was careful, precise. Like he was telling her a story, he didn't have the words to share. She reached into her basket, broke the bread in half, and handed him a piece. He took it. "Do you miss her?" she asked finally. He nodded. "The fire, she died with it. And the baby." Her throat tightened. "Mine too. The baby. I don't think I ever buried her. Just let her disappear inside me." He looked at her then. Really looked. Not with sympathy, not with sadness. With recognition. The kind that makes you feel like you've just been named for the first time. They sat that way until the stars pressed their silver faces against the sky. In the weeks that followed, he returned often. Sometimes alone, sometimes with one of the others trailing behind like a silent witness. He never stayed long. But when he did, he helped without asking, mending a fence, trimming branches, gathering herbs she couldn't reach. She stopped asking why. She learned his name, soft and round and sacred on her tongue. He never asked hers. He didn't need to. He called her with a look, with a gesture, with the way his presence curved toward hers like smoke toward warmth. Once, when a hawk screamed overhead and the chickens scattered, she felt his hand at her back, steadying her, not because she needed it, but because he offered. She let it stay there longer than she should have. She began to carve. Clumsy at first. But then something loosened in her wrists, her fingers remembering how to shape instead of survive. She carved birds, flowers, the silhouette of a woman with her arms outstretched. He watched her sometimes, eyes half-lidded, as though he could see something in her she hadn't yet found. They never kissed, but once, as he was leaving, she pressed a carved feather into his hand. And he pressed his forehead to hers, breath shared, eyes closed. It was more than touch. It was agreement. And then came the men from town. She saw them first, 3 riders, dust rising behind them like a warning. They wore the look of men who believe the land owes them answers. Their rifles weren't drawn, but their hands hovered near. He was still in the barn, brushing Birch's coat. She stepped out to meet the men before they reached the porch. "He yours?" one asked, voice sharp, eyes hard. She didn't answer. "You know they took from Calhoun's ranch? A rifle. Some hides. A dozen chickens." She kept her voice level. "I haven't seen a rifle. Or any hides. Or your chickens. You seen them?" She glanced toward the barn. "Just a horse and an old dog," she said. Their eyes narrowed. One leaned closer, his breath sour. "They ain't supposed to be here. You know that, right?" She held her ground. "And yet, here you are." The man smirked, spat at the dirt, and turned his horse. They rode off without another word, leaving a tension that clung to the air like smoke after lightning. She walked to the barn, her legs heavier than they should have been. He was already saddling his horse. "They saw you," she said softly. He nodded. "You'll leave." He looked at her, carved feather still in his pocket, heart carved in hers. "Not forever," he said. And then he was gone. That night, she walked to the porch and ran her fingers over the carving of the open hand. Below it, something new had been added. A second hand, smaller, reaching back. The days after he left folded into one another like pages too damp to separate. Her routine held, but she moved through it as if underwater, each motion thick with weight. The bread rose, the herbs dried, the fire crackled, but none of it warmed her the way it once had. She listened now, not just for the sound of hoofbeats, but for the silence that came when they didn't. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass by. The carved pieces on her shelf sat still as sentinels, horse, feather, fish, bird, each one a whisper from him. She cleaned them gently, like sacred relics, though she never allowed herself the softness of tears. That softness had been used, spent, dried out like creek beds in August. One evening, she found herself on the porch long after sunset, staring at the spot where his horse used to pause before tethering. She imagined him arriving again, quiet as ever, no grand return, no words. Just presence. That would have been enough. That would have been everything. But he didn't come. Instead, 2 men from town returned. They rode with a stiffness in their posture that suggested they didn't come for company. One dismounted. The other stayed in the saddle, eyes scanning the horizon as though daring the landscape to contradict him. "We need you to testify," the man on the ground said. She leaned on the porch railing. "Testify for what?" He tilted his hat back. "About the Comanche boy. The one who's been visitin'. Folks say you've been harboring him. Town wants to know if he's the one who took the rifle. If he's the reason we're missin' livestock." She didn't answer. "We're tryin' to avoid trouble," he said, voice softening as if kindness could camouflage threat. "But if it's war they want, it'll come. Best to end it before it starts." She looked past him toward the hills. They used to feel far away. Now they felt like a heartbeat. "I haven't seen him," she said finally. The man narrowed his eyes. "That ain't what folks are sayin', duh." She straightened. "Then maybe folks should look harder at themselves." He climbed back on his horse without another word. Dust lifted as they rode off, and she let it sting her eyes without blinking. That night, the wind returned, fierce and erratic, scattering dry leaves across the porch. The rocking chair creaked though no one sat in it. She wrapped her shawl tighter, but the cold wasn't in the air. It was in her chest, a hollowness blooming like frost on glass. She dreamt of fire. Not destruction, but warmth. A fire surrounded by 7 silent men. They stood in a circle, faces unreadable. He was there, on the far side. When she stepped forward, they parted. But before she could reach him, the fire flickered and he was gone. The next morning, she found tracks. Not from horses. Barefoot. Small. Leading from the east and circling behind the barn. She followed them, heart pounding like thunder held in her ribs. Behind the water trough, curled beneath a faded blanket, was a child. A girl, no older than 7, dark hair tangled, skin scraped and sun-worn. Her eyes snapped open at the sound of footsteps, wild and wary. The girl didn't speak, just clutched a woven pouch to her chest like it held her breath inside it. She crouched low, hands open. "You hungry?" The girl stared, unmoving. She rose slowly, fetched a piece of bread and a canteen, and set them down. Then she stepped back. The girl watched her with the caution of something feral. Then, quick as a blink, she snatched the bread, devoured it in 2 bites, and gulped the water like she hadn't swallowed in days. She waited. The girl didn't run. She just tucked the pouch deeper into her dress and whispered something too soft to catch. She opened her palm. "Come inside." The girl followed. Inside, she set another place at the table, poured a bowl of broth, sliced a pear. The girl didn't ask questions. She ate. And then, with the same suddenness, she slept. Curled like a seed on the hearth rug, the woven pouch clutched tight beneath her chin. That evening, as the sky softened, she sat beside her and gently pulled the pouch loose. Inside was a carving. A horse, almost identical to the one she'd been given. But this one had a mark on its flank, her mark. The one she used to brand Birch. A quiet sound escaped her throat. Half breath, half prayer. He'd sent her. The girl wasn't his daughter. Not by blood. But something told her she was his kin in spirit, trusted enough to carry what he could not. And with her arrival, so too came the message. He wasn't far. She tucked a blanket over the child, stepped outside, and looked eastward. Her eyes searched the ridges for movement, but the dusk only offered silence. Still, she felt it, deep in her marrow. A presence approaching. That night, she lit every lamp she owned. Not as a beacon. Not as a warning. But as a welcome. By morning, someone had left something on the porch. A carved arrow, notched at the tip, its shaft wrapped in strands of her own hair. Hair she hadn't known was missing. She pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. He was coming. And he wasn't coming alone. The fire had burned low. Only embers glowed in the hearth as a hush fell over the small cabin. She lay awake, the rough wool blanket pulled to her chin, eyes tracing the wooden ceiling beams in the faint light. The baby was asleep, bundled in her arms, chest rising in slow, innocent rhythm. Outside, the wind had eased, but tension still bristled inside her, like a thread pulled tight, one heartbeat away from unraveling. He hadn't come back after the argument. Earlier that evening, his voice had cracked, not from rage, but from something more fragile: fear. "I can't carry this alone," he had said, knuckles white on the porch railing. "You don't even know what you're asking me to give up." She hadn't answered then. She hadn't known how. Now, silence wrapped around her like the cold. Her lips brushed the baby's temple. The scent of milk and firewood clung to them both. It should have been comfort, but instead, it reminded her how far she was from anything familiar. The prairie stretched endless outside that door, and every man who had passed through her life had left her colder than the last. Except him. And yet now, even he seemed to be stepping away. The door creaked. Her heart jolted. But it wasn't him. It was the mare. The one he'd rescued from drowning last spring, pushing her head through the open barn window. Her soft breath fogged the glass. The horse snorted, then pulled back, disappearing into the darkness. That horse had nearly died. Broken leg, twisted spirit. But he'd believed she could be saved. So why couldn't he believe the same about her? She rose, careful not to wake the child. The wooden floor chilled her feet as she padded toward the door. Moonlight dusted the porch in silver. In the distance, she saw the faint flicker of a lantern moving between trees. She didn't hesitate. Her shawl flung over her shoulders, she stepped into the night, clutching the child tight. Each step toward the woods felt heavier than the last, like her past was dragging behind her. When she reached the clearing, he stood with his back to her, lantern in one hand, the other buried in his coat pocket. "You left the door open," she said quietly. He turned slowly. "Didn't think you'd follow." She didn't move closer. "You walked away." "I was trying not to say something I'd regret." "That I'm too much trouble?" "That I don't belong here." Her voice cracked, but she steadied it. "That maybe it was easier before me?" His gaze lifted, hard and unreadable. "I've buried 2 children out here. 2. In soil too frozen to dig. I've watched life drain from a woman's face because no doctor could reach us in time. You think this is about ease?" The wind stirred between them, but neither looked away. "I think," she said, "this is about fear. Yours. And maybe mine." He glanced down. His fingers twitched at the lantern handle. "You think I don't want to be the man who stays? You think I don't see the good in you? Every night I lay awake wondering if the next knock on that door is your past catching up, not mine." Her throat tightened. "You think I don't wonder the same?" For a long moment neither spoke. Then the baby stirred. A soft whimper rose from the bundle in her arms. Instinctively, she cradled it closer. "I didn't choose this," she whispered. "But I won't leave her behind. And I won't leave you wondering." His face shifted, something tender breaking through the guarded lines. "Why me?" he asked, barely audible. She took a small step forward. "Because you built this place with your bare hands, and when I knocked, you didn't ask why. You just opened the door. That's the kind of man I want my child to remember." The lantern between them crackled softly, casting gold across his weathered features. His eyes dropped to the baby, who now stared back with wide, unblinking curiosity. Slowly, he extended a hand, not to her, but to the child. The baby reached out, fingers grasping his gloved thumb. It was so small, that hand. And yet something in him stilled, as if the world had shifted on its axis in the touch. He looked at her. I don't have much. But what I have, this land, this cabin, it's yours. If you stay. She stepped fully into the glow of the lantern then. I've been running for so long, I forgot what it felt like to be offered something that didn't come with chains. No chains, he said gently. Just a hard winter, a leaky roof, and a man still learning how to hope. Tears pricked her eyes, but she smiled through them. Hope's enough. They stood in silence for a while, the stars wheeling slowly above them, breath rising in clouds. Then, from somewhere near the tree line, a sharp sound cracked the stillness. A rifle. He turned instantly, stepping in front of them. Get inside, he hissed. But she didn't move. Her feet rooted to the earth. Another sound, closer. This time not a gunshot, but the low grunt of a man, followed by a rustle. Footstep. Several. Closing in from the east. His jaw clenched. Now! She turned, clutching the baby, but before she could take 2 steps, a voice echoed from the woods. Drawled, menacing, unmistakable. Well, I'll be damned. Look what we found. He reached for his holster, but she gripped his arm. They know me, she whispered, shaking. Or they think they do. Doesn't matter, he muttered, pulling her behind him. They won't touch either of you. Another voice rose from the dark. That baby got my brother's eyes. You really think you can hide her out here? The firelight from the house flickered behind them now, fragile against the encroaching dark. The child whimpered again, sensing the tension, curling tighter in her mother's arms. He didn't look at the men. He looked at her. And what she saw in his face wasn't fear. It was resolve.